And so what's their obsession with children? Why is this, again, obsessive focus on children, feeding this kind of information to children, attacking children and profiling them in schools, taking them from their parents? How does that fit into this?
So children are very malleable. You can get them, you can install a worldview or a value system into them very effectively. They will believe fantastical things that are not true in ways that adults will not. And once they start to grow up, particularly with their parents' values, they become as equally likely as their parents to reject these things. You have an advantage taking over corporations, which is that corporations ultimately tend to be run by people who want money really bad. And so they'll make a lot of compromises if they have to. Like Nike whoever was CEO at the time might have known it was wrong to move into the Chinese market in some sense, but he also knew that the amount of money it would make Nike and him was astronomical. So he made a rational calculation and jumped on it and probably got very rich. So it's easy to incentivize corporate bigwigs, like CEOs. It's not as easy to because their incentive world is whatever it is. It's not easy to incentivize the so-called rugged individual, the average American. You can, but not very well, not reliably. Children, on the other hand, you can warp, and if you warp the kids, there are two effects that will happen. One of two things will happen with their families. Either the family will renormalize around the children, or the family will eventually split and the children will go separate from the parents if you can turn them into militant ideologues. Militant ideologues don't bend on their views. They throw people out of their lives. Another way to put it, frankly, is that they're in a cult. So if you can drag the children into a cult, then what happens next is that they'll either turn their parents into people that support the cult through the manipulation of parental love, or they will break that relationship entirely, which starts to tear apart the fabric of society. And in both of those cases, the communists actually win. It turns out the third thing that can happen is that the parents pull them back from the ledge. And that actually was significant to some of the struggles of the first 10 to 15 years in China and under Mao, is that parents were an anchor point where people would actually leave China to get away from the CCP. And it was primarily because their parents thought it was wrong and they would think of that. But here's the other thing. Children grow up and then they become adults, and their value systems don't become fixed, but they can be very close to it. They can become very difficult to change as they reach into their early 20s. And it turns out that if you spend 20 years educating or miseducating or really brainwashing and indoctrinating an entire generation of kids, now you have a complete generation that's going to work primarily for your interests. So they don't have to get all parents out of the way. Inclusive parents are fine. They have to get parents who don't support the agenda out of the way. They have to get conservative parents out of the way. They have to get normal people out of the way so that they can take the children into believing that their purpose in life is to grow up to be a good global citizen. Their parents just don't understand. That means sustainability and inclusion. So we have to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and we got to be, inclusive of all of our LGBTQ friends or whatever it happens to be. But children are malleable. That's why. And children are their parents' world, and so they can have a tremendous effect. If you, I can't tell you how often this is the case. Find a public official who wavered on the trans issue or whatever, and then came out, as we would see it, on the wrong side of it. Look into their family. Bet they have a child, a niece, a nephew, something that's trans. So if you get a trans kid, which doesn't really exist, but if you can transition a kid and make them a hardened queer ideologue who's fully committed to this in a family, the entire adult picture changes around that. They all have to, like, let's say that I'm governor of Tennessee, and I have a trans, niece or whatever, right? So I have this going on. Every time I step out to give a speech to my constituents, I have to think that my poor niece is going to hear it, and I'm going to get it when I get home. My wife is going to be furious if I upset poor little Sally that's going by Billy or whatever. And I have that holding me back from doing what I need to do as governor. And you will find that this is a compromising factor in an astonishing number of public officials, because they've pushed this agenda into children so hard and so fast that almost everybody knows somebody who has a child or usually a child or niece or nephew who's gone through it now.
But why trans? I mean, is this like the new eating disorder? Why is it this issue?
Yeah, I mean, it turns out to be something that's fairly easy to lure kind of three demographics of children into. One are the ones who are just generally kind of misfits, and all of a sudden they have a way that they can become cool more or less overnight. They can go from being the dork that everybody makes fun of to cool pretty much right away. So that's one group. A second group are what they would refer to as the incel boys, the teenage boys who just can't get a girlfriend. Maybe they're late bloomers, maybe they're ugly ducklings, maybe they're just weirdos, whatever it is that they're struggling. So they're not able to get a date. I didn't have a girlfriend until I was 18. So like I was this kid sort of, but those kids, they actually can feed them enough propaganda that leads them to do what the kids call transmaxing, which means basically turning yourself into your own girlfriend. They can't get a girlfriend, so they become their own girlfriend. And that's one of the primary vectors of male to female transition. Not the only one, but there are others. But that's a very significant one in kind of these dispossessed adolescents. All this is, by the way, attaches very strongly to autism spectrum scores as well, or other underlying personality disorder issues or trauma. But the third is girls who have basically anything else in the universe going on, who happen to be going through puberty, which turns out all the girls do at some point. And so when they go through puberty, many girls develop issues related to their bodies. It's a very stressful, difficult time. You don't know what's happening. People are looking at you differently. In fact, in ways that are very uncomfortable. You start to become aware that you are a sexual being that doesn't necessarily want to be one, and that it's icky and inappropriate. Things are happening to your body that are like gross that you wish weren't happening. You might end up getting groped or grabbed or whatever, especially by jerks at school. And, so all of a sudden you have like your physical body is going through a change that's not particularly great, and it's causing you lots of problems. And you can tap right into that really easily by telling these girls. And I think this is why it's most significant right now. And the numbers have switched from boys to girls being the primaries, that you can actually very easily tell these girls, well, if you hate what's happening to your body, that's because you really are a boy inside. And you can lead them down a path that all of this then includes: you're cool, you're affirmed, you're blah, 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 everything's good for you. A lot of times not in the main classrooms, but in after school clubs where you get to escape the torment of the school day. So you have the natural condition of the alternating stress and reprieve that actually is trauma bonding 101. So they get pulled further into the cult. But also, so those reasons are good reasons for using it and targeting it. But the other reasons are the commitment is so high, it's so damaging.
Right.
Everybody involved has to start rationalizing why they're doing it. The parents have to rationalize why they're approving what they're approving. Values have to change significantly, and it is just so inordinately destructive. But the motivations are underlying the same as why bulimia became a social contagion after Princess Diana came out and said that she had it. There was like a handful of cases of bulimia in the world, and Princess Diana said she had it, and then literally like every girl under 15 had it for like the next 2 months at least. And so that already happened. But so yeah, playing upon that vulnerability, especially in the cohort of teenage girls of body discomfort, kind of pushing it into a belief of a body dysmorphia. And then rather than trying to treat, if you were bulimic or you were anorexic or whatever, when I was in high school, there was a couple of people I was friends with they were really good at hiding it. We were all shocked when we found out. They knew how to dress to hide how thin they were. They knew how to hide their binging and purging or whatever it happened to be. But this is the opposite. This is actually just openly celebrated. It's like the biggest deal, because between media and what they're actually showing with the inclusion programs at school, they've actually taught everybody that you have to affirm it. And so these people who have craved affirmation their entire childhood have a pathway to affirmation that's just unbelievable. And then what it costs them, how do you come back? How do you come back from cutting off your own genitals? I mean, it's like, some people will have the what it takes, but most people, or many people at least, will rationalize it and project it onto other people for the rest of their lives. They'll go nuts. And there are other dynamics as well, but I think that it's to create a group of people who have fully bodily committed to a very radical ideology and have very little way back. Parents are another problem. That's the inclusive parent. They have we talked about Transhausen by proxy, that, these parents are trying to get virtue signals by proving how inclusive they are. Well, that's because everybody my age, which I'm in my 40s, was propagandized relentlessly in the late 80s going through the 90s of the horrible, awful, terrible conservative dad who would disown his gay kid. And so everybody's like in this disgustingly sick competition to prove, though that's not who I am. I wouldn't disown my kid. Look, I cut his dick off. And I still love him. And it's like, holy crap, lady. But so there's a dynamic happening with the parents too. And with physicians and with attorneys and with all of the other people that are in the broad apparatus of making that happen. But taking a step back, the Human Rights Campaign which was a civil rights organization for gays back in the 90s, took a violent left turn into all of the trans issues starting in about 2008. Well, if you do what you should do and you say, why did they change their direction so vigorously when they did? And you look, you find out they were also given a $25 million 3-year grant by the Open Society Foundation at the time. So somebody was incentivizing the turn into this next vanguard of radical politics, taking it from a civil rights issue into a critical theory, which is queer theory in this case, which people wouldn't have necessarily recognized. Nobody was talking about these things except academics and activists, 15 years ago.
And do you think this queering of the American child, that this is the most, if not one of the most important issues facing our country right now, or which issue?
It is the biggest child abuse scandal possibly in human history. The only one that really makes it's certainly in Western history. The Incas sacrificing children by the day to appease the gods or the volcano or whatever really was kind of probably worse. But besides that, certainly within the West, it is the biggest child abuse scandal ever. And what you are producing is a broken and confused generation who is being taught. The most insidious part of this isn't how much they're being broken or how they're being radicalized or how they're having stolen from them their capacity to go through identity formation in a healthy way with healthy boundaries, their developmental potential. It's not even the physical damage to the ones or psychological damage to the ones who get involved in it that's the most insidious part of this. What's actually the most insidious part of this is what we learned with What is a Woman? So what is a woman? And Ketanji Brown Jackson, who happens to be a woman, sits there and says, I would have to ask a biologist. And what she communicated with that fact was, I don't know. I have to ask an expert. I can't determine the most basic facts about reality without turning to an expert. So we're teaching children, are you a boy or a girl? Well, that's really up to you. And in fact, you're in charge of that. You're the expert. And then later, well, Billy says that he's trans too, and I don't think he is. Well, let's go through, and all of a sudden they have to summon not a biologist, but like a gender theory person or a psychologist who comes in and can manipulate in their psychology to find out if it's a real trans or a fake trans or whatever else. But they're teaching them it's not just trans, though. It's everything. Is 2 + 2 = 4? Well, yeah, it is, but not all the time. It can equal other things. Look at this confusing math that you're not ready for at 4th grade or whatever. And the answer is actually, they're lying, by the way. 2 + 2 can only ever equal 4. There is no option. There's no ambiguity in this. Changing, for example, the numerical base doesn't change the value. So there are lots of tricks they play, but they confuse them. So how do you know what 2 + 2 =? Oh, we're going to have to ask somebody who's an expert. We have to go find somebody who knows. We can't solve problems about life ourselves. So this comes back to the communist thing, because what it actually teaches at the very end of the day is total intellectual dependency. They do not want, we've said individuals, what they don't want are independent, rugged individuals, which the Russians called kulaks, which Stalin basically liquidated across Russia to make sure there would be none of those. And Mao called rich farmers and landlords and liquidated across China. They do not want people who can independently ascertain what's going on in reality around them and make decisions about it that lead to a successful life. They need a state of permanent, constant dependency. And so look at what trans gives you.
Right.
Dependent on a medical situation, dependent on hormones, dependent on somebody to tell you what the next turn in the inclusion road happens to be. It's a complete catastrophe of dependency.